The ice cracked before Hamish Kerr heard it. A single dry sound, like a rifle shot, that traveled across the frozen surface of Tezeron Lake and disappeared into the spruce trees before he could decide what it meant. Then the world fell away beneath his boots. He went through fast, the cold hitting every inch of him at once. His left shoulder struck a submerged rock shelf and spun him sideways in the black water. He clawed toward the surface, found the broken edge, and hauled himself halfway out before the feeling left his arms completely. His lower legs stayed in the lake. His left hand couldn't close around anything reliably. He lay there on the ice shelf with his cheek against the wet surface, and the temperature dropping toward -14. Bex had reached him before the echoes stopped. The 7-month-old German shepherd pressed her body against his back, her warmth so small against that cold it almost didn't register. Her dark muzzle came to rest on his shoulder. 20 meters away on solid ice, Ash stood at the broken edge with his front paws braced and his black and tan body low to the ground. He whined once. Then he looked at Hamish with an expression that asked a question no dog should have to ask. Hamish raised one arm. It felt like lifting someone else's limb. "Ash," he said. His voice had already gone rough with cold. "Find Roland." The young shepherd had never crossed the lake alone. He had never been sent away from Bex since the day they were born 11 minutes apart. He stood at the edge and stared, and Hamish could see him working through something in that bright, restless mind. The kind of calculation that has no clean answer. "Go," Hamish said. Ash didn't move for one terrible second, then he turned. His paws struck the ice in hard, rapid beats. He disappeared into the spruce shadows at the far shore, and the sound of his collar tags faded into the wind. And then there was nothing but Bex and the cold, and the long question of whether Roland would be home to find. Before we get there, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today, and subscribe to Paws of Grit for more stories of loyalty, grit, and the animals that remind us how to come home. 3 weeks earlier, Hamish Kerr stood in the kitchen of a house that didn't know him yet. The property had belonged to his uncle Ewan, who had died in December without warning, and left everything to the nephew he'd seen perhaps 6 times in 30 years. Hamish had driven up from Chilliwack in January, with 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, and no particular reason to arrive at any specific hour. The house was a low cedar-sided building at the edge of 8 hectares of mixed boreal forest near the south end of Tezeron Lake, surrounded by birch and second-growth spruce that clicked against the windows whenever the wind came in off the water. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, old books, and someone else's life. Hamish was 54. He had spent 26 years in the Canadian Forces, the last 11 with Joint Task Force 2, doing work that rarely appeared in official records and never came up in conversation. The kind of career that hollows a man out carefully, layer by layer, until what remains is competent and quiet and very hard to reach. His wife Elspeth had reached him anyway. For 19 years she had known which silences meant fine and which ones meant the opposite, and she had never confused the two. When the cancer took her 20 months ago, it didn't only take her. It took the person who knew how to read him. Since then, Hamish had lived in a way that looked functional from the outside. He slept with the bedroom window cracked regardless of temperature. He parked facing the road. He answered his daughter Freya's calls on the first ring, because that was the one discipline he had imposed on himself. Don't make her wonder. But the drive to Fort St. James had not been about peace. It had been about distance. Somewhere remote enough that nobody would notice how thoroughly he had stopped showing up. He had been at the property 4 days when the truck broke a rear seal on the access road, and he drove 30 kilometers into town at 40 kilometers an hour, with the heat failing and the radio picking up nothing but French country music and static. The feed and hardware store on Qua Road was longer than it looked from the outside, with plywood floors and a smell of grain dust and rubber boot soles. Hamish had gone in for a seal replacement part and coffee. He found both near the front counter. He almost missed what was behind the store, beneath a tin awning at the east end of the building. 2 wire crates sat on a wooden pallet in the thin January sunlight. A hand-lettered sign leaned against the nearest one. Working shepherds, ready for placement. The female had a honey-tan face with a dark saddle and amber eyes that tracked Hamish from the moment he stepped around the corner. She didn't bark or press against the wire. She watched him the way a careful person watches a door, neither afraid of it nor in any hurry to open it. The male in the second crate was already moving before Hamish reached him. Black and tan, both ears perfectly upright, with a restless intelligence that made him look like he was already 3 seconds into solving a problem. Nobody had assigned him yet. He bounced twice, sat, stood again, and pushed his nose between the bars with the complete conviction that every barrier in the world was a negotiation waiting to happen. The woman beside the crates introduced herself as Ingrid Wold. She was 67, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with silver hair cut close and pale blue eyes set deep in a face that had spent most of its life outdoors. Her hands were large and steady, the kind that had done hard work for a long time without making a fuss about it. She had raised dogs and cattle south of the lake for 38 years, and she was selling because her right hip had made that decision for her in October. "The female is Bex," Ingrid said. "Her brother is Ash, 7 months old. Working lines, raised around livestock and equipment. They understand basic commands but haven't been formally trained." Hamish crouched in front of Bex's crate. She leaned forward slowly and touched her nose to his knuckles through the wire. Then she sat back and continued watching him. "I'll take her," he said. One dog was manageable. One food bill, one set of vet expenses, one living thing whose absence might eventually matter. He had spent years limiting such possibilities. Ingrid attached a lead and opened the crate. Bex stepped down carefully, her body low and measured, taking in the gravel and the cold smell of the lot and the shape of the man holding her leash. He had turned toward the truck when the sound came from behind him. Low and complex, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, the sound of an animal communicating something that didn't have a word for it. He looked back. Ash had pressed one paw flat under the door of his crate and extended it toward Bex. She had stopped walking. She turned completely around and pressed her nose to the wire beside his paw. "Have they been apart before?" Hamish asked. Ingrid looked toward the lake. "Not overnight." A pause. "They came into the world 11 minutes apart. Neither one has slept without the other in the same room. You could have mentioned that first." "If I had," Ingrid said, "you might have thought I was selling a story instead of dogs." Hamish stood there in the cold with Bex's lead in his hand and Ash's paw still extended through the wire. Something moved at the back of his mind, a particular kind of stillness, the kind that settles over a man when the intelligence doesn't add up and his gut already has the correct answer, and he's still looking for a logical reason to ignore it. He had lost a teammate once. Not permanently. The man had been recovered alive 3 days later and had walked out of a field hospital under his own power and bought Hamish a drink and said it was fine. But Hamish still carried the memory of the empty space beside him during the extraction, the way he had stared at it, and told himself that following orders and leaving someone behind were not the same thing. For years he had believed they were. "How much for both?" he asked. Ingrid named a fair price. Together they secured the crates in the truck bed and covered them against the wind, and Hamish checked every strap twice. Ingrid didn't remark on that. She stood beside Bex's crate for a moment before closing it, one hand resting between the shepherd's ears. The expression on her face lasted only a second before she composed it. But it told him everything about what this cost her. "Right decisions have poor timing," she said quietly. "They almost never feel right while you're making them." Hamish pulled onto the highway as the afternoon light dropped behind the western ridge. Ash moved constantly in the crate behind him, his ears appearing and disappearing in the rear window. Bex sat perfectly still, watching the road they were leaving. Hamish had driven alone for so many years that silence had become part of the engine sound. Now there were paws shifting against crate floors, and the soft rattle of collar tags, and 2 young animals breathing behind him, and he found he couldn't tune it out the way he usually tuned things out. When he lowered the ramp at the property that evening, Ash hit the gravel at speed, discovered a rusted bucket near the woodpile, struck it with one paw, and leaped backward when it rang against the frozen ground. He considered the bucket for a moment, struck it again. The bucket rolled downhill with a hollow clang, and a sound came out of Hamish's chest that he recognized with some surprise as a laugh. It had been a while since he'd heard that from himself. Bex looked at him with her amber eyes slightly wide, as though the sound was unexpected information she was filing away. Ash hit the bucket a third time, apparently satisfied with his results. The following morning, Roland Cairns appeared at the end of the access road in an old green half-ton with a patched passenger door and 4 fence posts in the box that he claimed were taking up space in his barn. Roland was 62, heavy through the chest and arms, with a weathered face and a gray beard kept short, and a way of speaking that suggested he had learned long ago that most things worth saying could be said in fewer words than people usually used. He had known Ewan for 20 years, had fixed the man's tractor once, and they'd had coffee together every few weeks since, the way people do in small communities when they find someone else who doesn't need to fill every silence. He had heard about the nephew from Vancouver Island, and he had driven over because that was what you did. Without asking permission, he unloaded the fence posts. "I don't need those," Hamish said. "I know," Roland said. "I need somewhere to put them." He returned the next morning with roofing material, and the day after that with cedar boards and a bag of mixed hardware. They worked without talking much, which suited both of them. Hamish stopped declining the help sometime around the 3rd day, when it became clear that accepting it cost less energy than refusing it. Thomas treated assistance the way a man passes a wrench across a workbench, useful, temporary, and too ordinary to require ceremony. Ash decided Roland was trustworthy on the first morning, primarily because Roland's jacket pocket contained dog biscuits, and Roland made no effort to conceal this. Bex required longer. She stayed within sight of Hamish whenever loud tools were running, and watched Roland from a careful distance the way she watched everything, measuring the door before considering whether to walk through it. On the 5th day, Hamish was pulling old wire from the back fence when Bex gave a sharp cry and lifted her front paw. A hawthorn spike had driven in deep between 2 toes. He crouched and placed one open hand on the frozen ground between them. He didn't reach for her leg. Bex looked at his face, then at his hand. She had been raised to expect handling, but she was also a creature that had learned to evaluate what came before the hand moved. Hamish waited. She put her paw near his palm. He felt her whole body tighten as he touched her ankle, but she held still. He worked the thorn out, cleaned the puncture with the kit he kept in his vest pocket out of old habit, and wrapped the paw loosely. When he finished, Bex stayed beside him. Then, with the slow deliberateness she applied to everything, she placed the bandaged paw on the toe of his work boot. The weight was almost nothing. It registered anyway. He had expected trust to look like obedience. He had forgotten that it sometimes looked like this, a careful animal deciding, without fanfare, that you were something worth standing on. In the evenings they fell into a pattern Hamish hadn't planned. Ash slept under the kitchen table, surrounded by objects he had apparently claimed as property. One of Hamish's work gloves, a pine cone, Roland's wool toque from 2 days earlier, and an empty seed packet whose origin nobody could explain. Bex settled near the stove, facing the door. Hamish sat with coffee and found that the silence had a different texture now, not heavier, just occupied. He called his daughter Freya on a Thursday. She asked immediately about the dogs. "Ash stole Roland's hat and buried it behind the propane tank," he said. "Bex is still working out whether I'm worth the effort." Freya was quiet for a moment, then, "She'll decide you are." He wasn't sure he deserved the certainty in her voice, but he didn't argue. The weeks passed, repaired fence posts, a stove that drew cleanly, 2 dog bowls under the kitchen shelf. Hamish began driving into Fort St. James without timing his trips for the quietest hours. He spoke to the woman at the feed store about ice conditions. He stayed longer than politeness required. One evening he called Ingrid Wold, and she asked first about Bex and then about Ash, and he told her about the training and the fence work, and Bex's growing habit of walking the property perimeter each morning as though running a safety check. "Sounds like they found their place," Ingrid said. Hamish looked at the cabin's repaired window. For once, he didn't hear those words as a weight. In early March, Bex stood at the north fence one morning with her nose down and her ears moving in opposite directions. The ground where she stood had been flat the day before. Now a shallow depression ran between two fence posts, and the soil felt different underfoot, slightly hollow, when Hamish tested it with his boot heel. He called the Provincial Mine Records Office, and eventually reached a geotechnical inspector named Lynn Arsenault, who asked precise questions about the depression's shape and the property's survey history, and told him to mark the area and avoid it, and said she could have someone look at it by end of month. Hamish marked it with survey ribbon and moved the dogs away from the north fence, and told Roland about it the following morning. Roland studied the ribbon, then looked toward the lake. Old survey maps for this section show a prospect pit from the 1920s. Ewan mentioned it once, said it was nothing. Ewan said a lot of things were nothing, Hamish said. He did. Roland set down his thermos. Come stay at my place until someone takes a proper look. Hamish had considered it. Roland's house sat on the far side of the lake, 20 minutes by road, and both options were rational. But Bex had been watching the north fence every morning for 4 days, with a particular quality of stillness that he had begun to understand was a different kind of attention, and leaving felt less like safety than it once had. "I'll stay," he said. Roland's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. The way a person looks when they've accepted an answer they were expecting, but still wished were different. "Call me before you do anything," Roland said. Before, Hamish said, not after. Good. Because you're not as good at solving problems alone as you think you are. 3 days later, Hamish walked the lake edge at first light, as he had every morning since the ice started softening. The previous week's temperature had swung badly, -18 to +3 and back again in 48 hours, which made the ice unreliable in the middle sections where the inlet current ran just below the surface. He knew this. He had checked the thickness twice at the south end and stayed close to shore. He was not, in any reasonable sense, being careless. What he hadn't accounted for was the shelf, a section of ice that had refrozen over an air pocket during a freeze-thaw cycle and looked solid and was not, and which gave way under his right boot without any warning sound at all. The cold hit every inch of him at once. He struck a submerged rock going down and felt his left shoulder give in a way that told him the arm was going to be a problem. He found the surface. He found the broken edge. He got his chest out onto the ice and his legs would not follow, and he lay there and felt the cold making decisions his muscles could no longer override. Bex had heard the crack from the shore. She was beside him before he had fully understood what had happened. She pressed herself against his back and rested her muzzle on his shoulder, and she was 26 kilograms of warmth in -14, which was a fact rather than a comfort. But it was something to measure himself against. Ash was 20 meters out on solid ice. He had come to the broken edge and stopped. He stood low and still and looked at Hamish with an expression that had moved beyond worry into something more concentrated. The phone in his chest pocket had gone in with him, the radio on his belt as well. He had a whistle that might carry 200 meters in this wind. Roland's property sat on the far side of the lake, 8 minutes at a run across the ice, if the ice held. Ash had run that route with Hamish 5 times in 3 weeks. He had been to Roland's place twice and received biscuits on both occasions and remembered this clearly. "Ash," Hamish said. His voice had lost its edges. "Find Roland." The shepherd dropped into a crouch but didn't move. His eyes went from Hamish to Bex and back, and Hamish understood exactly what the hesitation was. These two had never spent a night apart. They had come into the world 11 minutes from each other, and had never since been more than 30 meters apart. Leaving was going to feel like something it shouldn't have to feel like. Hamish pushed as much steadiness into his voice as he could find. "Ash, find Roland, go." For 1 second, one full, terrible second, he was certain the dog would stay. That whatever had formed between the 3 of them since January was too strong to ask it to send one part of itself into the dark toward a single purpose. Then Ash turned. His paws struck the ice in hard, rapid beats. He moved straight across the open surface, angling toward the far shore where Roland's dock sat under 2 meters of snow. Hamish listened to the sound of those paws for as long as he could hear them. Then he couldn't anymore. And there was only Bex and the cold and the question he couldn't answer about whether Roland would be home. Bex pressed closer. When his breathing went shallow, she shifted her head until her nose touched the back of his hand. When he said her name, her ears moved. She didn't leave. She didn't make a sound or create any disturbance. She simply remained beside him with the absolute certainty of a creature that had decided, some weeks ago, that this was where she belonged, and saw no reason to reconsider. "Good girl," Hamish said. It was not enough for what she was doing, but it was what he had. On the far shore, Ash came off the ice at a run and hit the packed snow of Roland's driveway and didn't slow until he reached the porch steps, which he took all at once and struck the storm door with both front paws and began scratching with the precise, insistent rhythm of an animal that understood exactly what a door was for. Roland had been standing at his kitchen window for 20 minutes with his phone in his hand and a feeling in his chest that he had learned, over 62 years, to take seriously. He had spent the morning telling himself it was nothing. He had not quite convinced himself. He opened the door. Ash stumbled inside, soaked from the knees down, the length of his morning lead still attached to his collar. He seized the cuff of Roland's flannel shirt and pulled toward the porch and released it, and barked twice, and pulled again. Roland looked at the dog. He looked at the lake, visible from his doorway. He reached for his coat. He called 911 while lacing his boots. The dispatcher reached the Fort St. James Volunteer Fire Department and Cold Water Rescue Unit inside 3 minutes. The crew leader was a woman named Mona Desjardins, 46, who had led ice and swift water rescues for 11 years, and who asked Roland 3 questions, and told him not to approach the break point and was already moving before he'd finished answering. Ash led Roland across the lake at a pace that made the older man's breath come hard in the cold. The shepherd moved straight and without hesitation, glancing back occasionally to confirm Roland was still following. The kind of practical accountability that made Roland think, not for the first time, that dogs understood responsibility better than most people did. Bex heard them coming before Hamish did. Her ears moved. She raised her head but didn't leave his side. "Hamish," Roland's voice crossed the ice 30 seconds before he reached the broken edge. "I've got you. Rescue's 4 minutes behind me." Hamish had his eyes open. He had kept them open through will and through the simple fact of a warm dog against his back reminding him, every few seconds, that there was something in the world worth staying conscious for. "Here," he said. Mona's crew arrived with throw bags, a rescue sled, and a dry suit for the water technician, a man named Devlin Park, who went into the water without ceremony and secured a harness around Hamish's chest and helped his legs find the surface while Roland kept tension on the main rope from solid ice. Getting Hamish out was not gentle and did not need to be. What mattered was that it happened. Bex allowed Roland to guide her away from the broken edge once Hamish was on the sled. She moved beside it the entire distance to shore, with her shoulder close enough to touch the frame, as though she was still keeping track of where the warmth needed to go. Ash met them at the shoreline. He didn't jump. He circled the sled once, pressed his nose briefly to Hamish's hand, and then sat beside Bex and stayed there while Mona's crew worked. Hamish looked at both of them. His face was pale. His voice wasn't quite working. He said roughly, "Both of you." It wasn't a sentence. It didn't need to be. He spent 2 nights at the University Hospital of Northern BC in Prince George. Partial tear in the left shoulder. Mild hypothermia, well managed. Sprained ankle, no fracture. The doctors were satisfied. Hamish was not particularly interested in satisfaction. His first clear thought each time he surfaced from sleep was that he didn't know where Bex and Ash were. Roland had taken them. He texted on the first evening, "Dog's at my place, eating well. Ash stole my slipper. Bex is sleeping on your jacket." That second detail was unnecessary information, which meant Roland had included it on purpose. Hamish read it twice. Freya drove up from Kamloops and sat in the hospital chair with her arms crossed, and her dark hair still slightly damp from the highway, and said, "You could have called me." "You would have come immediately," Hamish said. "I'm here immediately anyway." "I know." He looked at the window. "I know." She watched him for a long moment, doing the same calculation Elspeth had always done, deciding which silence meant what. He wasn't entirely sure she arrived at the right answer, but she was trying, and that was its own kind of thing. "The dogs," she said. "Roland has them." Not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Beck stayed with me the whole time, kept nudging my hand every time my breathing changed. Never trained for that, just knew. He stopped. Ash crossed the ice alone in -14 and found Roland. Freya looked at the window. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Roland drove him back on the third day beneath a hard blue sky, no wind, the kind of clarity that comes after long cold. The geotechnical assessment had been completed during his absence. The north fence area had been staked and filled, the old prospect pit confirmed and capped. A permanent barrier installed well south of the unstable ground. Orange marker posts ran along the safe lake zone, driven in by the fire crew before they left. At the property, Roland stopped the truck, and Hamish had not fully opened the door before Bex appeared from beside the porch. She came across the packed snow with her head low and her amber eyes on his face, and she stopped in front of him and looked at him, checking that the information matched, and then stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest. He put one hand between her ears. He held it there. Ash came around the corner at speed, saw the crutches, and braked so hard his front legs went sideways. He stopped 3 feet away and crouched low and made a sound Hamish could only describe as complicated. Relief and restraint together, and something very close to an apology for the speed of his arrival. He wanted to jump. He understood somehow that he couldn't. Hamish reached down. Ash pressed his head into the palm and closed his eyes. Neither dog made a sound. Neither asked for anything. They leaned in and verified, with the patient certainty of creatures that make no distinction between hope and expectation, that he had in fact come back. For most of his adult life, Hamish Kerr had returned to rooms that were the same when he left them. Lights off. No footsteps crossing the floor because a truck had turned into the driveway. No shape lifting from us a chair because he'd come through the door. He had told himself for a long time that this was order, that it was what the work required. That attachment was a liability in a life built on knowing when to leave. He had confused control with independence, independence with peace. Standing at the door of his uncle's house with 2 dogs pressed against his legs and Roland waiting at the truck, pretending to check the porch railing, Hamish understood. Not for the first time, but perhaps for the last time, that the difference between surviving and living was not discipline or preparation or knowing when to go. It was allowing someone to leave the light on. Freya came for a week in April. She hung curtains. Hamish would not have chosen and cooked things that made the house smell like Saturday mornings used to smell, and she sat outside in the evenings, watching Ash attempt to herd Roland's old retriever around the yard, while Bex observed from the porch step, with the expression of a colleague watching a familiar mistake being made for the 4th time. "She's very composed," Freya said. "She has to be," Hamish said. "She works with Ash." Freya laughed, and the sound of it carried across the yard, and Ash paused in his herding to look toward the porch with his ears up, determining whether this development was relevant to his current project. Ingrid Wold called in May. She asked first about the property, and then with careful casualness about the dogs. Hamish told her about the ice, about Bex staying, about Ash crossing the lake alone in the dark with a stranger's dock as his only destination. There was a long pause on the line. "I knew they needed someone," Ingrid said finally. "I didn't know they needed someone who needed them back." Summer came slowly to the north. The lake cleared. The property became something other than a project. Bex developed a habit of walking the fence line each morning, pausing at the marked area near the north corner, then returning when Hamish called. Ash learned to move from one end of the yard to the other with reasonable restraint, though he still accelerated into corners and occasionally startled himself with his own speed. Roland came by most mornings with coffee he claimed to have made too much of, and stayed long enough to check whatever needed checking, and left without ceremony. Hamish framed 2 photographs and put them on the wall above the kitchen shelf. One of Elspeth, taken on a Thursday afternoon in Chilliwack, when she hadn't known he was looking. One of Freya and the dogs from her visit, standing in the yard with the lake behind them. He looked at both each morning when he put the kettle on, and they did not feel like loss the way he had expected. They felt like the shape of a life, arranged so he could finally see it clearly. He had gone to that feed store in January, believing he was taking one dog home. He had not expected to find two. He had not expected a woman who understood the cost of right choices, or a neighbor who measured his friendship in fence posts and coffee, or a daughter who drove 4 hours on an icy highway because that was simply who she was. But then, he thought, grace rarely announces itself. It arrives on its own terms, in the weight of a bandaged paw placed carefully on a work boot, in the sound of claws crossing ice in the dark toward a farmhouse light, in 2 dogs waiting at a door with the unhurried certainty of those who never once doubted you would return. They had not known he would be gone only 2 nights. They had not known the rescue crew would arrive in time, or that his shoulder would heal, or that the ice would hold long enough for Ash to cross it. They had simply waited and kept watch and kept the warmth going in the way that dogs do, with their whole bodies, without reservation, without asking what they would get in return. Hamish had believed he was going to that parking lot to find himself a dog. The truth was quieter than that, and it had taken a frozen lake and a 7-month-old shepherd running alone across it in the dark to make him see it clearly. He had gone there lost, and Bex and Ash had done the only thing they knew how to do. They had stayed close and run hard in the right direction, and made it possible for him to find his way back. Not just to the property, not just to the cedar-sided house with the repaired roof and the curtains he hadn't chosen and the photographs on the wall, but back to something older and simpler than any of that. The understanding that a place becomes a home not when the work is finished, but when something living inside it is listening for the sound of you returning. If this story reminded you of someone, a person or an animal who stayed close when it mattered, we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Those stories are worth keeping. And if you're new here, subscribe to Paws of Grit. We'll be here with more stories of loyalty, grit, and the quiet courage it takes to come home.